Hey, welcome back. We've been on this journey exploring set and setting, right? Really digging into how our whole environment shapes our experiences. Well, today we're looking at this incredible paper that just completely flips the script on how we think about substance use. And not just drugs, but pretty much everything we consume.
All right, let's get into it. The paper's called Informal Social Controls and Their Influence on Substance Use. And first off, we've got to give credit where it's due. To Deborah Malouf, Howard Becker, Arlene Foneroff, and Judith Rodden. Because way back in 1979, think about that, over 4 decades ago, they came up with this way of looking at things that is honestly more relevant today than ever.
And it all boils down to this one question. Seriously, for a minute, just set aside everything you think you know about willpower or addiction or the chemistry of a drug. These authors wanted to ask a bigger question. What are the deep, invisible forces that are really pulling the strings on how much of anything we consume?
I mean, we all know the standard story, right? It's always framed as this big battle. You've got the super powerful substance on one side, and then you've got a person's individual character and their willpower on the other. That's pretty much the way we're taught to see it.
And when you see it that way, it leads you to ask this very specific kind of question. Why do people take so much? But as the authors point out, that's not a neutral question at all. It's got a judgment baked right into it. It kind of presumes that we already know what the right amount is, and that anything over that line is some kind of moral failure.
So these researchers came along and said, hold on, let's try something different. They argued that if we really want to understand why people do what they do, we have to take the morality out of it, just for a second, and look at it like sociologists. Just observe what's actually going on.
And here it is. This is the pivot that changes absolutely everything. Instead of asking a moral question, they ask a social one. How do people, usually without even thinking about it, decide what's the right amount? That little shift in perspective, it just blows the whole thing wide open.
And this is so important. By changing the question, the whole focus shifts. It's no longer about abuse, it's just about use. The paper starts treating substance use like any other kind of consumption, like how we consume food or coffee or alcohol. The goal isn't to judge it, it's just to understand the patterns behind it.
So, if it's not just about the power of the drug and the willpower of the person, what's the missing piece? Well, the authors argue that it's all about something they call cultural recipes.
So what's a cultural recipe? It's basically all the unwritten rules that are just floating around in our society, guiding our behavior. It's like the social software running in the background of our lives, constantly telling us what's normal and what's not. And once you see it everywhere.
And this is the perfect way to understand it. Just think about it. Why don't most of us have a big slice of cake for breakfast? Or pop a bottle of champagne at a 9 a.m. work meeting? I mean, there's no law against it, right? It's because we've all learned the cultural recipe. There's a recipe for dinner that says you eat dessert last. There's a recipe for drinking that says cocktails are for the evening. These unwritten rules are incredibly powerful.
The paper actually breaks this down into 5 big categories of these informal controls. First, you've got the cultural recipes themselves, the what, when, and how. Then there's learning. We're not born with these rules. We're taught them by our families and friends. Sumptuary rules tell us who gets to play. Think of age limits for alcohol. Sanctions are the social high fives or dirty looks we get for following or breaking the rules. And finally, there's just plain old expedience. We tend to do what's easy, available, and convenient.
Okay, so we're all swimming in this sea of unwritten rules that guide us. But here's where the paper gets really profound. What happens when you suddenly just destroy all those rules?
And the authors use the absolute perfect example, prohibition in the US. Think about what happened. When the government made alcohol illegal, it didn't just get rid of a substance. It completely wiped out a century of cultural knowledge about how to drink socially, how to drink in moderation. The only rule left was to break the rule. So, like the paper says, people didn't go to speakeasies to have a social drink, they went there to get drunk. The whole context for moderation just vanished.
So this is the key distinction they're making. On one hand, you have informal controls. They're like living traditions. They're flexible. They come from the ground up, from the real experiences of people over generations. And on the other hand, you have formal controls. These are rigid laws. They're imposed from the top down by officials, and they're based on policy goals, not necessarily on lived wisdom.
And if you follow that logic, it leads to the paper's most explosive idea, a real challenge to the way we've handled drug policy for decades. What if these formal laws are actually making the problem worse? Okay, so let's walk through their argument step by step. First, these informal social rules, these cultural recipes, they're not random. They represent a kind of collective wisdom that a society builds up over time to figure out how to use a substance safely.
Then, step 2. Formal laws, especially total prohibition, do something much more damaging than just banning a substance. They drive it underground, and in doing so, they shatter all of that collective wisdom. They destroy the very social fabric that teaches people moderation and safety, and they leave a total vacuum.
Which brings us to the knockout punch of this whole line of thinking. By creating these top-down laws that destroy the bottom-up social rules, could we be accidentally creating the very crisis we're trying to prevent? Are we literally legislating the problem into existence?
At the end of the day, this paper from 1979 leaves us with a question that feels like it could have been written yesterday. The argument isn't about having no control at all. It's about what kind of control actually works. What if the real key isn't just piling on more laws, but instead trying to understand and maybe even help grow the powerful, organic, informal controls that have guided humans for thousands of years? It's definitely something to think about.